I mean, let's be reasonable here. IQ is so overrated in our society and in people's minds. Take Bobby Fischer, the often said to be greatest chess player in the world. He had an IQ of 187, and I bet I could beat him in a cage match. Like, come at me, Bobby Fischer, let's go. I challenge you. Okay, so apparently Bobby died in 2008, so that's a problem there. Hello, kindred longevity lifestyle designers. This is Gavin here with secrets of longevity.com. I was just trying to kind of open with a comical point there, which I wanted to have as an overlay to everything I was going to talk about in this video, because while this is a topic that also a lot of people seem to want to dismiss as if there's no correlation between studies that show IQ versus people's actual intelligence. It doesn't measure, obviously, everything people are capable of doing, so why do we put any emphasis on that? And I've heard people even talk about IQ and comparing it to BMI as to how useless it is. However, that's not the case. BMI is useless because it measures something about people and doesn't factor in the fact that they might have all muscle that's causing them to be heavy in comparison to their height. So it's not necessarily they have high fat, it could be muscle if they're very built. When it comes to IQ, these are specific tests on specific things we can do. So some things that IQ tests tend to test are visual and verbal skills, abstract reasoning and problems, often trying to find connections between two unrelated things, tests on arithmetic, spatial imagery, reading, vocabulary, memory, and general knowledge. So I had never really given much thought to IQ before until just fairly recently, this past winter/spring, and I had tried to do online IQ tests, and they're notoriously unreliable, basically because they're just things people throw up. You don't know which are the valid ones or not. Or the ones that you sign up with an email. These are all very, first of all, they're short. I actually went in for valid psychological testing this spring, and it culminated in 5 to 6 hours of testing, and I actually didn't even know I was having IQ tests done. And so coming out of it, it was quite amusing in having these results and just learning about oneself. And I think it's a valid way of deepening your understanding of yourself. And what I'm trying to emphasize is that this is just one portion of skills that any of us have and can develop. So someone who's extremely empathetic and has developed an intense ability to be with people and help them and feel what they're feeling and are going through, that's often been called EQ, or emotional quotient. So IQ's intelligence quotient. You have your emotional side, you have your physical ability, extremely proficient athletes. Obviously, to them, IQ is something that isn't going to improve their performance in their sport to any great degree, so it's not a goal for them to improve it or to even have been born with it and grown up with it. So this is going to be a fairly general video about IQ, but I'm going to touch on a few things such as IQ's relationship with longevity and health. But then what really got me wanting to make this video was seeing some discussions on a private Facebook group around wild foods and rewilding, and there were some people who were critical of it, and I just didn't understand the reasoning around it. Not that it's necessary to have high IQ by any means, or that it's even desirable, but that they were coming at a place of criticizing it because in the idea of rewilding and getting back to diets and lifestyles our ancient ancestors would have followed, that generally they had better health. It wasn't something that was overly necessary to have to a high degree to survive out in the wild. You had to have other skills. And so that got me thinking, and that actually influenced my interest around this. after having already had this testing done in the spring. But before I get into all that, I want to start by talking about this thing I went through in the spring, and it's going to be a bit of time for me to, I guess, talk about myself. I don't do that too often on this channel, so hopefully it can give you a bit of insight into me. And I'm not sure to what length and depth I'm going to go into this because, you know, it's quite personal. But you may, depending on how much you've watched my channel in the past, know something about what I've grown up with. And I had an odd time growing up, to say the least. I had, now in hindsight, it's clear why this was going on, but I had quite a bit of disinterest in authority figures, following through on things in school. I got heavily into drugs, not hard drugs, but, you know, decently hard. I did pretty much anything except cocaine, meth, and heroin, just to say the least, between the ages of 14 and 17. And all in all, I somehow managed to scrape through school quite average, at an average level, despite barely doing any schoolwork whatsoever except the bare minimum to get by. And throughout all that, I had tons of other interests that I was focused on after school, which probably helped indirectly in some way. And a lot of it was in this sort of compartmentalized periods in my life where I was specifically highly interested in one topic that had nothing to do with what I was learning about in school. So, after more than 15 hours of testing, it was determined this spring that I've had and still have both ADHD and Asperger's. So, I don't know, some people seem to be shocked by that. Those who know me in person, they can understand the ADHD aspect to some degree, especially if they've seen the way I live. And so the reason I had this testing is just personally I've had struggles with certain areas of my life that you wouldn't obviously see on camera, but perhaps you might notice it in perhaps the way I talk, the way I often edit my videos. That could be slightly indicative of, I guess, the way I think and the way I speak. While I can get through complex thoughts and communicate them, I'm often kind of staggered, and I do edit out times where I have to pause, or I stumble on my words because I'm thinking faster than I can speak. So it was very useful to get that diagnosis. And for me, I don't see these as massive detriments, or even I don't ascribe to the idea of illness when it comes to mental states. I think these are just tendencies. There can be obviously environmental things that may have causes for me to be more exacerbated in terms of the negative things, but there are negative sides to these. There are behaviors that once you can identify and compartmentalize them, then you can have an approach to working with and solving them. And for me personally, I'm doing it through non-drug ways. So definitely the main thing that I need to work with is the ADHD, because a lot of it has to do with motivation and staying on task and completing things. For me, it's not as much the hyperactivity, it's being the ability to reach the goals that I have for myself. And I have throughout my life been able to achieve certain things, but not to the degree that I believed that I should be able to achieve them. So throwing in that thing with Bobby Fischer was kind of tongue-in-cheek, because I kind of forgot about this until I was really thinking about this, but back in grade 3, I'd just gotten into a new school, because I actually went through French immersion, and I had learned to play chess with family, and there was a chess tournament, and I just randomly entered it, and I ended up winning the chess tournament despite being one of the youngest people in the tournament. And I remember the final match being against someone in grade 6 who was kind of like seen as the nerdiest kid in the school. And I think when I went to high school, he was in grade 12, I was in grade 9, and he was still like extreme geek, like stereotypical in every way. And I was just like so impressed with myself that I ended up winning that I figured, you know, I don't need to play chess anymore. I don't think I played it on like 1 or 2 occasions, 3 occasions since, because to me that was like, I did it, I won this tournament, I don't need to do this anymore, I accomplished this thing. So the interesting thing for me was when I got this IQ test as part of the whole psychological assessment. I don't even actually know how many of the factors were tested are the stereotypical IQ test, because there was only 5 categories. Perhaps in some IQ tests there's more, but there was a lot done in each one. Like literally, I said there was 5, 6, 7 hours of testing. I mean, it was 15 total hours for the assessment because there's some talk that goes on between myself and the psychologist, but you know, a certain amount of it was this testing with like various tests, some written, some with objects and things you had to line up. But basically, I came out of it with several very high results, and then one medium and one extremely low. And that one area, which I'm basically not ashamed to say it, I'm borderline retarded in executive functions, which is the classical ADHD thing. So in most people's cases with IQ on these different categories, they are very much all across the board the same. There's going to be differences, but not huge differences. Then some people are right in the middle, and high IQ people generally all high all across the board, so they can be very productive in life without too much difficulty. But for me, I'm low, medium, and then the rest were very high, like literally almost 130 IQ points high. And so unfortunately with the other parts of it, when I average it out, I'm 115 to 120 IQ. So my only reason for sharing that is just to kind of give you insight into me and what I'm doing here and explain parts of myself some people might not understand. It's also partly why I guess over my own personal life I've had a lot of annoyance with people around me. I am quite introverted just because I can't stand people who can't think as quickly as me and be on the same level on certain topics. I'm compassionate towards them, and I've greatly improved my ability to relate to them and be softer with them. But I was known by my friends growing up at certain stages, worse than others, as being very arrogant, and some people still say that about me now. But I think that probably only comes out, at least now to the greatest degree, when someone does come up against me with that inability to remain in that logical, reasonable place. I have a high standard for debate and discussion and going over points, and that's a huge thing that I've always been drawn to in my life. So when people don't self-correct in their ability to discuss something, then I go into the place of putting them down, because obviously if you're not going to debate on the same level of rationality with me, you're not bringing anything to the table, and it's rude to try and emotionally manipulate someone, which is sophistry, which is that thing people do when they don't seem to get in there with their points and you've already refuted them and they get emotionally hurt. So it's actually, technically it's not me being arrogant, it's me responding to something that I'm increasingly learning how to deal with. And by the way, I'm going to be doing a video in the very near future, maybe a month from now tops, on the topic of how we can improve our IQ through lifestyle means. So exercises, nutrition, supplements, and things like that. So you can look forward to that as sort of the next video in this series. It's not going to be an ongoing series, just maybe those 2 videos, but I might do the occasional video in the future on the topic as well. So stay tuned for those. And as always, I've just linked all the studies below, numbered as I go through them. So this idea of something controversial I wanted to talk about, I'm actually not going to get that far into it, but it is the basis for what I'm going to be talking about and what this relates to the idea of rewilding and the issue of IQ in relation to ancient peoples or our Paleolithic, Neolithic man. There is, obviously, most people have heard that there's ideas of IQ and race. I'm not even going to refer to studies because I'm not going to try and push a position on this, just that there is more research showing that this is the case, and it seems the people that are anti-IQ research or racial IQ research, they are guilty of doing the moving the goalposts. They say, oh, well, we can't form these conclusions because, there's not enough evidence. Then years happen, there's more evidence, and no, we need more, and that's the idea of moving the goalposts. It's a logical fallacy of this idea of denialism, and I think it's very concerning when there's any kind of scientific denialism. We see it in a lot of different areas, but the basis for wanting to deny it is somewhat obviously motivated by altruistic intentions, if we think of, there's obviously been a long history of racial issues and racial tensions all over the world. But that doesn't mean you don't keep looking at facts. There's benefits that can be had from these things, and there's talk of trying to ban this research. It's absolutely ludicrous, but the research goes on, and there's beneficial things that are found from it. It's like trying to say, because of the nuclear weapons that have been launched and the nuclear power plants that can leak, we should stop all research on nuclear compounds. There's hundreds of thousands of different applications and uses for nuclear compounds than just nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons. And those two things are actually only have been made possible through government. I'm not going to get into that in great detail, but those didn't come out of private industry. They were all funded by governments with the intention of using them for specific things. So they simply wouldn't have come about in a pure free market. So that's a big aside, but you can kind of understand what I'm saying here is that science can be used for good, it can be used for bad, and just because people have these ideas and fears around certain things, and sometimes there can be a history of it when you think of eugenics and things like that, but that shouldn't stop the research because it is very telling of where people can improve on things and also the rates at which people improve on things. For example, I don't have the study below. In doing this, I was looking at something which was talking about, I think it was Pakistani immigrants coming to the U.S., and first generation they'd be around an IQ of 82, and then within second generation there was already an improvement up to 88. But basically what we can understand is there is a certain component of heritability to IQ. And what I think is most interesting when you do look at this and you look at the areas of the world in relation to their IQ rates, it's obvious that the places in the world that have developed out of agriculture further back in time have the higher IQ rates. Plus there's the caveat of the higher north you go, so into colder climates, because of the scarcity of food at greater elevations and greater degrees north, that stimulated the development of intelligence in the hunter-gatherers that first went there. So that combined with the further back in time development of agricultural practices meant more generations and selection for higher IQ. Now some people would think, oh well, wasn't it the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East that first developed that? And there was a golden age of Islamic rule and that kind of came back, and obviously it's developing and has been developing for a long time since. But if you compare that to, say, Europe or China, Japan, South Korea, these areas that have the higher intelligence of this research that's looked at IQ on a global scale, they have had more sustained culture in terms of they reach a certain peak and they keep growing. Even though they developed after the Middle East kind of rose but then fell down and is rising back up and has been rising. But there was a bigger dip compared to Europe and Asia, Northeast Asia specifically. So hunter-gatherers that were more concentrated towards the equator had lower IQ just because their environment demanded different things of them. They didn't have that need for looking for foods in ways that develop the things that we now associate with IQ. They were developing other things. They, in many cases, were taller, more athletic for long distance running or strength, a whole wide range of things. And this idea that we can just simply ignore the averages just because somehow people think that's going to prevent people from excelling and becoming whatever it is they want. When you talk about averages, that doesn't mean that you're stuck to them. I don't think Neil deGrasse Tyson cares much for what people think of his race type in terms of that having anything to do with his intelligence and his abilities, which obviously far outshine 99% of people, 99.5, 99.9% of people. But you can't deny when you look at Nobel Prize winners, inventors, and kind of see the things that are going on, and there's actually a very high rate of Ashkenazi Jews in there, and that's another thing a lot of people kind of forget, that Ashkenazi Jews rate on the highest level there with an average IQ between 110 and 115. A lot of Northeast Asians, specifically South Korea and Japan. China's actually a little lower, but they're the highest in Asia, and they're in between Ashkenazi Jews and average Europeans. And then if you want to get really specific about Europe, you can look at individual countries or individual sort of roots, or whether you talk about Celtic or Anglo-Saxon or further Eastern Europe. You can get very specific, but you don't really need to do that. That can be interesting, but it's kind of futile. But it does kind of show a little bit, like when you think about the economies in Europe, and you look at the countries that are pulling ahead, aka Germany, versus the countries lagging behind and dragging down the European Union in terms of being in deficit. But that's getting very specific. I didn't want to get that specific. But really what matters is the individual. If you have kids and you want them to be smart, you do some of the things I'm going to talk about in the future video. You would also just acknowledge that people have different strengths, and some are almost seemingly random. I grew up playing drums for about 8 years and really went to school to study them full-time, percussion and jazz drumming. And I was acutely aware of the successful jazz drummers in history weren't Celtic Anglo-Saxons such as myself. But if I wanted to be a drummer, I wasn't going to let that stop me. So link number 3 below is an article. I came across this a while back. I even posted it on my Facebook page a year or two ago when this study came out, or this research. They discovered some footprints of a prehistoric man running to catch prey, presumably. And so there's footprints tracked in the mud, and it was actually accelerating, and then the prints left the point in the mud where they were able to be preserved. And what was found was this person was running, and they can measure this by the gait, nearly as fast as Usain Bolt, and so they can guess that this person was not even sprinting because they were speeding up, and that they were going to be able to run faster than Usain Bolt when you consider the fact that they were barefoot and in soft mud. So if you give them track shoes and the things that sprinters today have to accelerate them, this person just chasing prey kind of casually, obviously they were running, but they weren't in an all-out sprint because they were accelerating. And so you can then draw the conclusion that prehistoric man had this ability to, at a fast run as fast as our fastest sprinters today, or almost on par. They would have been on par, if not better, with the same equipment. So our ancestors had these skills that we don't have today, but our ancestors had lower IQ. And I'm making that assertion based on comparisons of traditional tribes that are still around today and that were around that got their IQ studied. Now, something that is often mentioned by the wild food proponents, and I'm definitely all for wild foods and not trying to knock them in any way, I'm just trying to be realistic about the facts here. They talk about our ancestors having bigger brains, and people just think, oh, bigger brain, that means more intelligent. Well, that's not always the case. It's actually the number of neurons you have. It's the way the brain is wired. So obviously, if you have an extremely small brain, that's going to be different. But if we're talking about slight differences in brain size, you can have a more densely packed neurons in your brain. A lot of people try to talk about the difference between women and men in terms of intelligence. Just as an aside, women have smaller brains than men compared to body size, but they do have more neurons packed in there. And if you look at the bell curves of average intelligence in women versus men, if you know men are a curve like this, so you have the spread, there's the average, the majority of people within this band here. There's going to be the higher end that slopes off, and there's very few people up at the highest end. And then you get very few people at the lowest end. Well, if you map and put women's average IQs over men's average IQs and plot each of those, women's band fits right within the male band. So the average falls in the same place, but women are in a narrower band. Whether that's environmental or biological, that's what's being debated. But we can't be uncomfortable about talking these things. These are just facts. And, you look at the top IQ people in the world in terms of Guinness Book of World Records, there, for a long time, was someone at the very top who was a woman. Marilyn von Savant, and that's where we get the term savant from. So you can't let that limit you, and you can't let facts limit you. You just have to acknowledge them, and you look to examples. And there's people reaching the pinnacles of the high end of all different things, whether it's intelligence, whether it's physical ability, whether it's musical, creative ability. Different people from different places excel in them, but we also tend to have things that groups we belong to excel within those areas. that's just biology. That's just something that exists, and we can address and work on the environmental factors that might be at play there and create more equality, but in the pursuit of that, we can't wipe out and ignore the fact that biology exists and that there is the influence of hormones, there is the influence of our genetic traits. So I found link number 4 below quite interesting. It was looking at a variety of different European IQs from the past and also more present. It also speculates on the differences between IQ rates in Europe versus the US, because the US was made of many different generations and groups of immigrants coming in. And what was actually found was that often the most intelligent people were the one immigrating to a place where there was more opportunity. So this is the idea of IQ, wealth, and longevity. There's an argument to be made that if you have the ability to see and understand to a greater degree the world around you, in terms of the skills that IQ is categorized under, you're more likely to see incoming danger or less advantageous aspects of a country, and you have a desire to escape that. You have a desire to move beyond that and look for more freedom. So people in the past were coming to the US, whether it was the Ashkenazi Jews, and there's actually a comparison of US Ashkenazi Jew IQ to Israeli Ashkenazi Jew IQ, and they are higher in the US on average. But then, for example, you look at Ireland. Ireland now, as it is today, has one of the lowest IQs in all of Europe, around mid-90s, lower mid-90s. But the Irish that came over many generations ago to the US, there was a lot of conflict, but they integrated, and they actually rose up in very short order in just a few generations, because it was found that their average IQ was above 100. It was 102, 103. So that then led them to higher positions in the career hierarchy, I could say. And the same thing was kind of concluded about the Scottish at the same time. So I was just interested in that in terms of the Celtic side of it, trying to look for reasons for my own history and if there were genetic causes for the way I am. So what increases and decreases IQ development is important to understand. So I kind of touched on that when talking about there's things that can definitely detract from it. This will be something I concentrate more on in the next video. But link number 5 below is a YouTube video, which is an interview with Dr. Murray A. Strauss, who looks at spanking as being a major detriment to IQ. So that can bring it down 10, 15, 20 points, depending on how far on the spectrum of abuse that extends into. Something that's quite interesting, and it kind of is a good thing to look at the difference of genetic versus environmental effects of IQ. And this has been acknowledged since the 70s. I found studies from the 70s talking about this all through the 80s, 90s. This is a more recent one though, and that's link number 6, and it shows Ashkenazi Jews right next to Sephardic Jews, which is the more Mediterranean, African, as well as Middle Eastern Jews, versus the European Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, all being in Israel, and all often, in many cases, going through the same schooling, and the IQ tests done on both show a stark difference in IQ. So this brings into some of the theories around the development of IQ in populations and how selection happens. And if you remember me talking about cultures and lineages from colder regions having better selection for higher IQ, because that's what you needed to survive, if you understand the history of Europe and the history of Ashkenazi Jews, there's actually been more recent discoveries that the Ashkenazi Jews were, at first they thought they were from the Khazars that converted and came into Europe, which is sort of more, I guess I'm looking at a map to myself, but it would look reversed to you. So that was what was thought, but it's actually turned out that, that's link number 7 below, that they were more central to Europe when they converted, and that's been found with tracing the maternal line to more central Europe, basically, which is interesting if we're talking about the IQ. Because of the difference in religion, Jews were made to have certain roles in societies. They weren't allowed to have conventional careers, so they were kept in both money-based careers in banking, but also in the academic careers. So if you think about gene selection, this population that already has higher IQ than much of the rest of the world, and you're taking this group and putting them into the areas of society that require the highest IQ, you're going to develop that very specific racial group, because they also were very strict about not intermixing their genetic roots. And so over time you have the Jewish population, the Ashkenazi Jews, which top the world in average intelligence. I think you go ahead 100, 200, 300, 400 years, there's going to be an effect of equalization of IQs the world around as people just move in and out of different careers and they aspire to do things that they see other people doing. You're going to have people with high IQs wanting to do things that you don't need as much IQ to do, and you have people of lower IQ groups wanting to do more academic-based careers, and it's not something that is all that daunting to think about, and it doesn't make me uncomfortable. It's just facts. So just to also throw a few things out there, those who claim that people, when we're talking about groups having lower IQ, whether it's South America or Africa, etc., people often talk about oppression causing that. And to a certain degree, poverty has some effect, but it's not a massive effect on IQ. A huge effect on IQ is abuse. That's well established. So there's a strong, obviously, correlation between certain types of abuse and oppression. But a lot of these populations don't have anywhere near the degree of oppression that would have once existed. And if you look to the Ashkenazi Jews, arguably the most oppressed group in history, they kind of top the list. And you look at Japan and China, they were oppressed at one point. They have very high IQ. So the environmental argument doesn't have as big a sway. So you hear different people talking about percentages of what part is genetic of IQ, what part is environmental. I'm not going to make any pronouncements except saying that genetic obviously is more dominant in the result of that. Now that brings me to the final link, link number 8. IQ is falling in the modern world. This is concerning in that there's probably a number of factors causing that to happen. One could be the standard of education falling. One could be rising government powers purposefully limiting people's ability to grow their IQ, because there was the Flynn effect for most of the 20th century, which was with each generation, or literally each year, a 0.3% increase in IQ. And so with each generation, you're going to end up with, I think it was 8 to 15% increase over a decade or two. I guess that's 2 decades. It's showing, a fairly steep drop over the last half century. So this is concerning in that, like I was saying, there's environmental effects. Things like fluoride can obviously affect IQ. People hear about that quite a bit. And I'm going to explore more of these in a future video on the topic, but I think IQ is something we should preserve. So it's kind of the motivation I have for this video, is talking about rewilding, and there's kind of this criticism of IQ in that it's a modern post-agriculture thing that has developed quite rapidly, but it's allowed us to have the benefits that we see today in technologies and things. And I know most rewilders understand that we're not trying to go back to this point of primitive, absolutely no modern technology. So we have the benefits of things around us that we have, and you can get the benefits of a lifestyle that's more replicable of what our ancestors did, and you have the benefits of greater nutritional density. And if anything, I think that should increase people's IQs even greater, especially if they have some mode of way of operating within the society we have today. There's the limits of what you want to do in society today with its detriments, but obviously the pinnacles of things that were made possible because of agriculture and because of agricultural revolution aren't things that we need to throw away. We have these advancements in IQ, that range of skills that are very logical, rational, and intellectual, which offer a lot of value. And some people having greater amounts of it are beside the point. Compared to what we had thousands of years ago. We've come light years in that respect. If you compare that amount of change to the difference between the intelligence of, say, a chimpanzee and Neolithic man, we've created more, and I think the future for where humanity's headed looks very exciting and very promising. So let me know what you think about this video in the comments below. Like, favorite, and share the video if you feel so inclined. And with that, I'll talk to you next time.